Okay, thank you all so much for your patience. We very much appreciate your kindness as we deal with some of our technical issues. Very excited to be here today. My name is Natalia. I'm the Assistant Program Director, and I have the pleasure of introducing our two speakers today, Megan Rose Woolever. Megan Rose holds a PhD in East-West Psychology from the California Institute of Integral Studies and an MA in Religion and Society from the Graduate Theological Union. Dr. Rose is an initiated ceremonial magician, Shakta Tantric, and fairy seer in the folkloric pagan tradition of fairy seership. Also very pleased to introduce. Is there some feedback? Sorry about that. Also very pleased to introduce Ryan Indigo Warman. Ryan Indigo Warman is a PhD candidate in East-West Psychology at the California Institute of Integral Studies. If you are on the line, if you wouldn't mind muting yourself, please. Thank you. California Institute of Integral Studies, where he holds an MA in philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness. Ryan Indigo is an ordained druid and fairy seer in the folkloric pagan tradition of fairy seership. And their talk today is called Rewilding the Pagan Soul, Albion, Ecopsychology, and the Epigenetic Memory of Place. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for the introduction. We're pleased to be here from sunny San Francisco, California, and thrilled to be sharing with you really decades worth of research that we've done both collectively and independently around eco-spirituality, and specifically our relationship to the ancestors and to the land and the spirits of place. So Albion, it's the ancient name of England, Wales, and Cornwall. And when you use the term Albion, it really evokes the mystery of megalithic stone structures, subterranean burial chambers, otherworldly sacred groves, and numinous holy wells. Sometimes Albion's referred to as the pagan Holy Land, because it's the land to which many pagans pilgrimage to remember, reclaim, and reconstitute their memory by accessing the undying records contained within the stone, the water, and the tree. It's believed that to undertake pilgrimage to a sacred site is to open oneself to the power and the potency of that place, wherein one is activated, changed, and expanded by the experience. Like Jerusalem, Mecca, or the Hindu Shakti Pitha, it is in the terra firma of place that we can journey to find ourselves anew. From ancient stone circles to chthonic barrow, the memory of our wild pre-Christian inheritance is quickened and reshaped by Albion, giving succor once again to the pagan soul. And although many of our grimoires have been destroyed and our ancestral wisdom has been burned, stoned, and tortured into silence in many cases, still the rock, the root, and the well retain the codex of pagan knowledge, if we can only get quiet enough to listen. So in this workshop here today, we will discuss how making a pilgrimage to ancient pagan sites, in this case Albion, can stimulate our memory, awaken our intuitive gifts, and give us greater access to the wisdom of our ancestors. Through the lens of ecopsychology and epigenetics, we'll explore how conscious interaction with burial mounds, holy wells, and sacred groves, megalithic stone monuments, and more can help us all reclaim our identities and birthrights as modern pagans, witches, druids, and seers. So let's talk a little bit about the art of pilgrimage. Religious studies scholar Houston Smith says that the object of pilgrimage is not to rest and recreate or recreation, right? To get away from it all. It's to set out on pilgrimage, is to throw down a challenge to everyday life. Nothing matters now but this adventure. There's a stony road to climb on foot, a rough, wild path in a landscape where everything is new. The naked glitter of the sacred mountain stirs the imagination. The adventure of self-conquest has begun. Specifics may differ, but the substance is always the same. Travel brings a special kind of wisdom if one is open to it. So, as contemporary pagans, we may have lost many of our pagan lineages and the ways in which our ancestors lived with the land, but we have not lost this art of ancient pilgrimage, this ancient art of pilgrimage to holy places, to change, activate, and initiate us into the pagan mysteries. So let's look really quickly at us here in the United States, since this is where the root of this conference is happening. Because most of us, or many of us, I should say, here in the United States are actually transplants, meaning that our ancestors didn't live on this land originally. And what that often gives rise to is what in the Celtic terms we call heraeth, which is a longing for our spiritual home. And pilgrimage is one way to satisfy that longing. But I want to just pause here and say that pilgrimage is really a mindset because all of your ancestors are actually already inside of you. So although we're talking today about Albion and we're focusing on going to Albion, I want to really make it clear that you can also connect to the ancestral memory of the land that you live on. Again, giving respect to the indigenous people who've lived there before you. And you can connect to the ancestral memory in your body because your blood and bones hold this memory. And you don't necessarily need to spend a lot of time and money and energy going some far off place to make a pilgrimage. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But much of what we'll explore here today, both in theory and practice, doesn't necessarily require, right, travel to a far off place. And that being said, undertaking the actual rigor and adventure of a physical pilgrimage somewhere can be a powerful initiation. It certainly has been for both of us. We've pilgrimaged both together and separately to Albion many times. My first pilgrimage was in 1987, and most recently we went together in 2016. And each trip has left an indelible mark and really quickened our personal practice. So today we're going to unpack a few key concepts related to the art of pilgrimage, and then we're going to dive into the landscape and how we might interact with various types of sacred sites. But remember, all land is sacred. So you can connect and take a pilgrimage even in your own backyard. So I just want to make a quick note on the term pagan. We are defining pagan as a follower of a polytheistic religion, which is sometimes called Neo-Pagan. And this includes witches, druids, goddess worshippers, seers, and other pagans whose spirituality typically orients around eco-spirituality and animism. So let's talk about reclaiming our pagan roots. Western esotericism scholar Wouter Hanegraaff states, the problems of the modern world, particularly the ecological crisis, are regarded as a direct result of the loss of pagan wisdom about man's relationship to the natural world. And a recovery of this wisdom is regarded not only as desirable, but as urgently needed. So as Westerners, for many of us, we have inherited a kind of post-Christian landscape. And our pagan roots and the practices of our ancestors have kind of been paved over by progress or ridiculed by colonizing influences. But much pagan knowledge was forced underground. And although it was forced underground, all practice and knowledge has not been lost altogether. It's simply been hidden in plain sight. Most often it's found in folklore, folk magic, and oral tradition. Now, that being said, we want to contest that the practice of paganism is not actually about historical or liturgical accuracy, because paganism is a living, breathing tradition that evolves and changes like any other religion. And furthermore, apostolic succession from our progenitors is really not a criteria for legitimacy in polytheistic religions. We are many different peoples and lineages, some newer than others, with varying beliefs as radically different as Catholicism is to Southern Baptist is to Mormon. So we really must do the work to heal and remember from our tacit knowledge, right? Which is expressed in this silence and mystery and primordial understanding accessed often through our bodies. So following Polanyi and Moustakis, we can really use ourselves as a research subject through heuristic methods like self-inquiry, intuitive inquiry, organic inquiry, and embodied inquiry. And what happens when we do this is it gives rise to a kind of cultural resurrection, whereby from the chthonic ground of tacit knowing, we literally remember a culture through our ancestors, our bodies, our intuition, and through dialogue with the land. Comparative mythologist and pagan priestess Kathy Jones suggests that there are 4 ways to discover our primordial ancestors: through archaeology, through myth, through sacred sites, and through our spirit self or our past lives. In her work, Spinning the Wheel of Anna, a spiritual quest to find the British primordial ancestors, she states, the sacred sites way of discovering our primal British ancestors is through inspiration and attunement in the ancient sacred places to the memory of the ancestors. Relatively little is known about the actual religious and spiritual beliefs of the ancient Britons, but there are long barrows, round mounds, circles of stone and earth, dolmens and standing stones in vast numbers. And some of these, such as Avebury and Avalon or Glastonbury, which we'll talk about in a second, are presently being visited by thousands of people on pilgrimage in search of the experience of mystery. And others remain isolated and rarely visited. In the busy and quiet, we can attune to the ancestral energies lying dormant in these places. Here in the stones and sacred mounds hold the still reverberating echoes of the voices of our long departed ancestors. And if we listen, we may hear them.
Thank you, my love. So, as we said, Albion is the ancient name of England, Wales, Cornwall, and Scotland. Its use has been attributed from the 6th to 4th century BCE by Avienus up through the late 10th century and Athelstan and the formation of the Kingdom of England. The Celtic linguist Xavier Delamare argued that it originally meant the world above, or the visible world, in contrast to the world below, i.e. the underworld. And one of his signifiers for that is that the Proto-Indo-European word for hill is alb, A-L-B. So by about the 1st century of the Common Era, the name Albion referred to the entire island of Great Britain. And it was later restricted only to Caledonia, the Roman word for modern day Scotland, whose Gaelic name is Alba. The name Britannia actually comes from the Greek and then was Latinized in the 1st to 3rd century Common Era. And it's interesting to note that both New Albion and Albionora, meaning Albion of the North, were briefly considered as alternative names for Canada during the Canadian Confederation from 1864 to 67. So the name Albion really evokes the spiritual memory of pre-Roman and pre-Christian Britain, especially for poets such as William Blake, who helped revive the term during the Romantic period. And there are numerous legends about the giants of Albion, as well as the lost lands of Lyonesse and Ys, which are connected to the Arthurian legends and mysteries. So it's unknown if there was ever another unified name for the island of Great Britain. We know that there were individual tribal names and numerous regional kingdoms, and we think of Albion as the spiritual name or the name of the overarching realm, long before there was any unified monarchy of the island. We find hundreds of stone circles and henges, from smaller circles to massive structures like Avebury and Stonehenge, where the stones weigh upwards of 40 tons, and in many cases have been confirmed to have been quarried from many, many miles away. In the case of Stonehenge, the Prestley Mountains in Wales, several hundred miles to the west. These installations align most often to the rising sun on the summer or winter solstices, as well as to stars and constellations. And these are examples of psychogeography and geomantic alignments, because these megalithic complexes align to each other, creating a vast super complex that spans most of southwestern Britain, a massive sacred landscape that was used to track the passage of times and the seasons, as well as other stellar phenomena. The concept of geomancy includes the idea that many of these stone henges or circles, including Stonehenge, were built over underground water aquifers. We learned this in 2016, that their theory was to channel the energy of these ley lines in this underground water to maintain the balance between human, nature, and cosmos. One of the stone circles that we visited in Cornwall, called the Merry Maidens, is an odd number of stones in the circle, 27, I believe. And it's been confirmed to sit on top of an underground aquifer. So the experience that we had, what my active imagination told me, is that when you had all 27 people lined up with their back to the stone and conducting ritual, your viewpoint is going out across the landscape between the other two stones on the opposite side of the circle. So if everyone is practicing in the ritual space at that same time, it's pulling up the water energy and then casting it out metaphysically over the land. There are other theories that Stonehenge may have also once been a massive covered mound, similar to the West Kennet Long Barrow or the Newgrange installation in Ireland. So part of our method of inquiry with these pilgrimages has been the practice of ecopsychology, which is the study of the human-nature relationship. This word and field is generally credited to Robert Greenway and his early explorations in the mid-1980s at Sonoma State University. And then about a decade later, Theodore Roszak collected a number of essays on ecopsychology. 1996 was published by the Sierra Club. He brought in a lot of other ecofeminist authors, including Joanna Macy and Chellis Glendenning. So the practice of ecopsychology is deeply connected to wilderness therapy and education. It often includes earth-based spirituality and ritual, with the goal of healing the disconnection of the modern world. And in practice, this often involves sustainability, homesteading, permaculture, and organic agriculture. One of our good friends and colleagues, Dr. Craig Chalquist, took this idea of ecopsychology and developed it further into what he called terra psychology, which is the embodied memory of place. And that involved the amplification of ancestral spirits, place names, myth, and archaeological research, as well as ritual, contact, and incubation with the spirit of place. Ecopsychology also often includes the observance of the 4 seasonal holidays and cross-quarter days, which are basically the equinoxes and solstices, and then the midpoints between those two, which were traditionally held as festivals. And there's a strong thread in ecopsychology embodied by Glendenning and other that's known as neo-primitivism. This desires a return to a simpler way of life, more in tune with nature and natural rhythms, and less technology in our lives. Ecopsychology also raises the issue of cultural appropriation when Native American or indigenous beliefs are practiced and adopted by non-Native peoples. There's a film I was shown in college called White Shamans and Plastic Medicine Men that discusses this in depth. My belief, our belief, is that neo-paganism offers and may arise from a desire to connect to the hereditary indigenous traditions of our European descendants. Gerald Gardner's Wicca and the witchcraft revival of the 1960s and 70s drew heavily from shamanism and ceremonial magic, as well as from the cunning men and women and the hedge witch tradition of the United Kingdom. In 2001, an American religious identification survey cited Wicca as the fastest growing religion in the US. From 1990 to 2001, there was a 143% increase in Wicca practitioners in the US alone. We should also note that European paganism was first suppressed by the Roman Empire and then later by the European witch trials from the 15th to 18th century. And the anti-witchcraft laws remained in effect in the United Kingdom until 1951. So when we bring epigenetics into this conversation, we're asking if it's possible if these traumas are epigenetically encoded into our DNA. And as are modern neo-pagans drawn to their respective traditions in order to heal these wounds, as well as the broader disconnection of modernity?
So let's talk a little bit. Oh, there was our other eco-psychology slide. Let's talk a little bit about epigenetics. So what is epigenetics? I am by no means a geneticist. I am a psychologist and a religious studies scholar. But one of the interesting things that geneticists have been revealing in the study of DNA is this idea that epigenetics really encodes in us traits and attitudes and beliefs and experiences that aren't necessarily encoded in the sequence, the DNA sequence of an organism, but on the cellular and physiological level, there are traits that result from external or environmental factors. So these alterations may or may not be hereditable. And research suggests that we inherit much more than just physical characteristics from our ancestors. We inherit their trauma and their gifts as well. So this in turn really affects how we feel about ourselves, how we perceive the world, and it informs our very ability to heal, learn, and grow as individuals. In 2015, Dan Hurley wrote an article for Discover magazine called Grandma's Experiences Leave a Mark on Your Genes. And what I thought was really genius about this article was he talked about how you were, I was, an egg in our mother's ovary when she was in utero with your grandmother. So there is the experiences, the feelings, the attitudes, the food even that grandmother was eating that affected your mother, that then affected you, all within your grandmother's body. I think Kathy Jones has a beautiful way that she expresses this. She states that hidden within the DNA of our cells, in the energy patterning of our psyches, are the memories of all that we have ever experienced as incarnating energy beings throughout all time. It is possible to access these memories. We can remember who we were, how we lived, what we believed, and our primal ancestral roots. We can hear our own voices as ancestors. So for those of us who identify as pagan and seek our spirituality in nature or outside of Orthodox religion, alongside this quest for our ancestral knowledge comes the collective and sometimes epigenetic memory of the trauma our ancestors endured, what is now being understood as the pagan genocide of the 15th to 18th centuries, commonly referred to as the burning times. And a mentor, an elder in the witchcraft community of ours, Orion Foxwood, posits that this has caused a kind of post-traumatic inquisitional syndrome. This is the behaviors, beliefs, and actions associated with multi-generational trauma due to the witch trials. And this includes PTSD and the descendants of those who were persecuted for their pagan beliefs and practices. But the good news is that we can heal this. And pilgrimage is one of the key tools. Psychotherapist Mark Wolin, in his book, It Didn't Start With You, How Inherited Family Trauma Shapes Who We Are and How to End the Cycle, states, we need sentences, rituals, practices, and exercises to help us forge a new inner image. And the new image can fill us with a reservoir of calm, becoming an internal reference point of peace that we can return to again and again with new thoughts, new feelings, new sensations, and a new brain map ingrained. We begin to establish an inner experience of well-being that starts to compete with our old trauma reactions and their power to lead us astray. Psychiatrist Norman Deutsch states it this way: the brain in the brain that changes itself. He says, we can change our brains simply by imagining. We can imagine. What we can imagine, we make possible. So by using the access points of sacred site and the ancient monolith, our deep memory is evoked. Our inner eye is stimulated, and often we find ourselves seeing ourselves, our lives, and our history through new eyes. Visions may come of the old ways of the ancestors, and subtle memories can be triggered by placing our bodies in the air and the land and the sea of our ancestors. And then by internalizing the images and creating ritualized action in these spaces, we give our imagination ample content for recontextualizing the pagan ethos, a priori to the days of persecution. Yes, we have to move through the traumatic memories to get there, but always with the intention of moving farther back into the recesses of our blood and our bones to find the hidden power of these places and their original use. So let's now look at some key access points or sacred landscape elements in Albion specifically and explore how we might interface with them. So I'm going to switch to these notes. We're having a little technical issue here with our slideshow, so we have to switch to paper notes here. We're going to share our experience of each type of natural site that we've pilgrimaged to, along with exercises that can help move you into and access altered states of consciousness while you're in these sites. And again, remember, these sites are specific to Albion, but the general type of site you might be able to find anywhere, even maybe near where you live. So let's talk first about caves. In this particular case, we're looking at Ceridwen's Cave, which is at Caird Castle Ruins in Wales. And this is a sacred cave that is about 150 feet underground. And it also includes a well. So on the left, you're seeing the sort of tunnel or the entryway that leads to the tunnel, which is like was barely enough for Indigo, who's about 6'2", to like hunch down and crouch through. And then it opens into this, this cave area, which is maybe like 200 square feet total, not very big. But in it, on the right, you'll see there's a sacred well in there. So I'm going to give you one final quote from Kathy Jones, because this is such a beautiful example of cave energy. To enter a cave is to return to the goddess womb. Pilgrims who crawl through a rocky underground tunnel representing the birth canal are regarded as born again from the yoni of the goddess. When the earth was known as the mother, journeying into her depths were sacred passages. The dark mother of all life. The remains of large round earthen mounds built from 4500 BCE onwards are found in great numbers in Brittany, Ireland, Wales, Scotland, and England. They too are shaped like the pregnant mother's womb. A narrow vaginal passageway leads to the usually one and sometimes several small dark womb-like chambers. Although these mounds contain some human remains and are called burial chambers, they are much more than this, representing the swollen pregnant body of the mother to which we return when we die, and from which we will all hopefully be once more reborn. They were places of magic and meaning where the ancestors were honored and contacted. So in this particular case, Ceridwen's Well, this is a cave where remains were found that were 30,000 years old. And the remains were of two bodies, and one, both of them are thought to be either royalty or of the sort of priestly class, because that the remains had red ochre and sacred ritual burial objects with them. So moving into the cave, and one of the practices that is really powerful to do with a cave type setting is toning. Toning and chanting. So if you have chants or you know chants, you can use those as you're moving into the depths of the cave or while you're in the cave, or simply toning, making sound poems, sound tones. And what this does is it kind of not only vibrates the resonance of your body, but it kind of vibrates the resonance of the cave. And it's thought to be a technique for sort of waking up the bones and the stones. There's in many traditions, there's a very strong resonance between the stone energy of earth and the bone energy in our bodies. And so vibrating or toning sort of begins to quicken and kind of like a cymatic or sonic boom, it brings us into greater resonance. And personally, in the cave, in this particular cave, we were in there in dark, in complete pitch black for a while. And that's a powerful tool to use as well, is a sort of darkening practice where you're in the dark in a place, because I certainly had visions begin to arise kind of like in my inner eye as we were in this dark toning in this cave. So let's move to the next potential contact point, and that is a grove. And in this case, we're going to visit the Bleeding Yews in Nivern Churchyard in Wales. So this is a 700-year-old site with a church and a graveyard located on the site of these grove of yews. But it's definitely a site of pagan worship prior to the building of the 6th century church. Peter Wollebine, who's a German forester, in his work, The Hidden Life of Trees, shares that trees hold and share memories in their root systems, and they communicate with what is underground through their mycelial network. In fact, when a tree is getting ready to die, it will send down into its roots all of the data, all of the information and experiences that it's collected through its lifespan, and it will send it through the mycelial network into the roots and sort of upload it into all the other trees. So when you add onto that a graveyard, what you're looking at is that the trees are not only holding the wisdom of the other trees, but also of the ancestors buried there. And this is what Celtic folk wisdom teaches, that trees are connected through the roots and hold this ancestral memory. And it's really not clear, in this case, these are all yew trees. It's not really clear which came first, the connection of yew trees to the churches or the churches to the yew trees. But yew trees are really associated with the underworld and associated with the graveyard. Yews can live to be hundreds of years old, and in pagan tales, they were said to mark sites that were sacred to the earth goddess. And so they may have predated many of the graves and the buildings that were built on top of them. They grow very slowly, and they're an evergreen, and they are said to symbolize rebirth. They have also been linked to the world tree or the tree of life, and trees in general are access points. They're access mundi points, right? They're connected into earth, but they reach up into heavens and they mediate things through their hearts, through the center. And so one of the phenomena that's really noteworthy about the bleeding yews at Nivern Churchyard is that they bleed. So there is this very interesting red viscous substance, which you can kind of see in the pictures on the right, that extrudes from the trees. And it's not exactly sap-like. It's more like this, like I said, a viscous substance, and it smells like with this metallic iron or minstrel blood tang to it. And these trees will extrude this during certain rituals and times of the year. In fact, when we were there in 2016, we had a group of pilgrims that we were there with, and only one of the trees was bleeding when we got there, and then by the end of our ritual time there were 3 of them that had started bleeding. So I thought that was really noteworthy. And a practice that you can do, and that we did when we were in this grove, and you can do really in your own neighborhood with whatever trees are around you, is tree breathing. And tree breathing is a technique that you either stand in front of a tree or with your back to the tree, and you breathe down into your roots, and imagine that your breath as you're breathing down into your roots is being picked up by the tree and breathed up through the tree and out its crown. And then you inhale that down through your body, through your crown and out through your roots, and you create a circuit. And then you reverse the circuit. You draw the energy up through your roots and out your crown, send it into the tree, and breathe it down through the tree and the roots. And it creates this beautiful circulating energy that will often open and deepen your experience of tree wisdom.
So these are two examples of dolmens. On the left, we have Pentre Ifan in Wales, southern Wales, which translates to Ivan's village, which we found interesting because our guide on that trip in 2016 was the late Druid Ivan Macbeth, who had emigrated from Britain to Vermont. On the right is Bryn Celithy. Quick note, in the Welsh Gaelic language, the double D is pronounced with a TH sound. So this is Bryn Celithy on the right on the island of Anglesey, which is an example of a covered mound dolmen. And there's a theory that the Pentre Ifan on the left was also once a covered mound similar to the one on the right, because there are local village records and lore about its excavation. These are burial chambers, and they were also used for ritual. They're found all over the world. There are some examples in the Americas, but they're all over Europe, including Spain, Italy, Eastern Europe. There are some examples in both Russia and China. And interestingly, there are 35,000 of these installations on the Korean Peninsula. Part of the tradition that we were taught by a druid named Paulden Jenkins on our 2016 pilgrimage is that the initiations that are believed to have taken place in sites like this involved basically a ritual death and rebirth, where you would go inside and be sealed in with the stone for 3 days and then undergo a rebirthing ceremony at the end of those 3 days. And, you know, there's an interesting correlation there to the death and resurrection of Jesus as well. This particular installation of Pentre Ifan is dated to 3500 BC. That's over 1,000 years before Stonehenge. There's other local lore about sightings of fairy and gnome entities there. And the mythology is that these mounds were entries into the underworld or the other world. And so one of the practices that we engaged in quite frequently in these types of structures was toning and chanting. As you can see, both the open and enclosed versions are going to create some very interesting acoustics and can help activate that active imagination and open your mind to any impressions or ideas or visions that might come.
So cliffs are another powerful point. They're an in-betwixt and in-between place, where one place ends and another place begins. And all those in-betwixt and between places, between land and water, between night and day, are places that are in the liminal or have powerful opportunity to connect us to an altered state of consciousness and to the other world. So here is the Land's End cliffs in southern Cornwall. And these cliffs are noteworthy for a couple of reasons. One is that they manifest what are called simulacra. And simulacra are natural forms, such as rocks, that look like beings. You can kind of see in the image on the left here, this rock has a kind of forehead and nose and chin and shoulder. And this cliff sanctuary here is actually comprised of giant quartz crystals. It's thought to be an ancient gathering place and an initiation site. And actually just off to the side of some of these simulacra is an ancient cairn wall or fogu that remains. There's the remains of an ancient cairn wall and was used ritualistically. These simulacra are generally thought to be sort of the guardians of a place, or like giants that sit there. And the lore of this area is that off to the shore, and I experienced this actually, I'll talk about this in a second, that off to the shore, there is a sunken land, sometimes called Lyonesse or Ys, YS, and that this sunken land, which is sometimes conflated with Atlantis, was a civilization that was off the shores of this continent, and then for whatever reason was buried under the water. And one of the practices that we did here was a kind of scrying, where, you know, particularly where you have a lot of mist or water, you can go into a sort of soft gaze where your eyes are very relaxed and almost half lidded, and begin to sort of breathe with and merge and mingle with the terrain around you. And as I was doing this when we were here in 2016, before I knew that there was a legend of lands off to the coast here, the west of this area, I actually was scrying into the mist, and I saw this sort of land, this island village off through the mist, and I thought that was odd. But you know, you just sort of make a note of these things and move on. And then I shared it with our guide, Pagan Jenkins, and he said, well, there's actually a myth that there is this sunken land off there. So I thought that was fairly noteworthy, that, you know, there is still this sort of intuitive or vibrational resonance there with the memory of these places.
So this is an ancient Iron Age village called Cairn Uni in Cornwall. And this is considered to be one of the best preserved sites and examples of this type of village, which was inhabited for a solid 1,000 years from the 5th century BCE through the Iron Age up until the end of the Roman occupation at the end of the 4th century CE. There are a lot of local legends about this place, including this underground initiation chamber that we went into and also did some toning. It's called a fogu, which is the Cornish word for cave, and its use is actually unknown. But we suspected and felt that it had been used for both ritual initiation and healing. I want to go back to the first slide real quick, just to point out the circular structures were essentially great houses or group homes, about 20 feet across, and they appear to have been constructed in a sort of a yurt style, where they would build a stone circular wall up about 3 or 4 feet, and then probably a wooden framework to support the thatched roofing over that. On the lower left-hand corner of the village itself, you can see one of these great circular structures, and there are a couple of little half walls on the top and bottom there. And we believe these created little hollows for the animals, which would have slept inside the structure with us in order to help heat the structure with their body heat. So I'm sure everyone smelled quite nice, but they probably didn't notice. We also met the local druid, Laurie Dennett, who is the owner of the home that you can see in the upper right corner, and the groundskeeper of this site under the UK National Heritage Trust. And he came to be the keeper of this place through a very remarkable synchronicity that he shared with us. And on his property, also sits the stone circle that appears to have been connected to this village, which is a small fire pit type structure of an enclosed stone circle. That's the perfect height for seating, about 2 feet off the ground. And then built into it are 7 very tall dolmens that you would kind of put your back to and maybe scry into the fire in the center of the pit. It was very cool to be here and activate that active imagination and try and imagine what daily life was like here in 500 BCE. And that practice of regression and visualization, as well as the active imagination and the toning, if there's a space that calls for it, was one of our ways in this particular site. This was another one that I was extremely activated by. This is the megalithic complex known as Avebury. It is a stone circle a full mile wide. It's the longest one of its kind that we know of. It's 14 times the size of Stonehenge, and it's 5,000 years old. And we've been making the case that all of these stone complexes were built to connect with each other and form a lattice work of a geomantic earth grid through which humanity connected to Earth and to the cosmos. And we also received teachings about this from our friend and guide, Paulden Jenkins, on this trip. In this particular site, we have a great earthen mound followed by a moat, which the local historians believe the moat would have been about twice as deep and the earthen wall about twice as high. That's accounting for 5,000 years of natural erosion. And within this circle are massive stones like we find at Stonehenge that are up to 40 tons in some cases and quarried from miles away. So that's the great circle. And then within it, there are two smaller circles, which my impression was that one of them would have been connected to the goddess, as it had three stones representing the threefold goddess within it. And then the other circle had a single phallic stone in the central. So that would have been the sun god to the moon goddess counterparts within the greater circle. These long avenues on either side that you can see on the picture on the left were considered theory for a long time until they finally found the archaeological remnants of them. And so the vision that came to me would have been of thousands of people with torches dancing into the tail of this long avenue, approaching the great circle, perhaps having an experience in each one of the inner circles, and then proceeding out through the right-hand side down into this other ritual stone circle that has also been excavated and confirmed. And so this would have made like a giant fire snake that would have been visible from miles away on the hillside. This is a picture of Avebury today. It has a village built inside of it by a man who acquired the whole property ostensibly to build a village and develop it, but really his goal was to preserve as much of the site as possible. On the right, we have one of the great stones that remains. A number of these stones have been lost and systematically destroyed by the church for several centuries. Each year on the solstice, they would throw a big festival and choose one of these stones to destroy by digging a great pit in front of it and getting a raging bonfire going, and then excavating out the foundations, pulling the stone down on top of this fire and letting it get superheated, and then throwing water on it to cause it to crack and shatter. And then these pieces were then carried away and used by the villagers to build other structures that remain there today. It's a similar thing that we have determined probably happened in Egypt with the limestone covering on the pyramids, later being broken off and excavated and used to build many of the mosques in the area. The other lore about this particular site, and one of the things that makes it interesting to me, is that it was a place of Druid college and education, and a site of frequent ritual, festival, and celebration, as opposed to Stonehenge, which is believed to have been primarily used for burial, like those other smaller dolmens we just examined.
So let's talk about burial mounds. In this case, this is the West Kennet Long Barrow, which is in the Somerset region, just maybe a mile, if that, from Avebury. So it's part of that whole complex. If you remember back to the first slide, there was the circles, and then there was the sort of long tubular area, and that is the West Kennet Long Barrow here. So this barrow was constructed 5,500 years ago. It's a Neolithic burial and ritual chamber. There are many chambers that appear throughout this barrow. Most of them have now been collapsed, but only a few of them were actually used for burial. In fact, they found skulls and bones lining the walls inside this chamber. And then other chambers were used for various other purposes. In fact, when we went in 2016 to this location, there were remains of ritual that someone had done, candles and offerings and things that someone had done. So this is an active site used by contemporary pagans in this area for worship and ritual and practice. Interestingly, right near, adjacent to this, so if you're looking at the lower left hand picture, off to the right, maybe, I don't know, not even a half a mile, is Silbury Hill, which is a mound that is sort of shaped like a pyramid, but with a flat top. And it's actually noted for a lot of paranormal activity around Silbury Hill. The lore is that perhaps Silbury Hill and the Barrow are fairy mounds, or they're haunted. And with the burial mound here, with West Kennet, you can actually go in. The image on the right is the entry stones, which you can walk behind and go inside that first chamber in the barrow. And our practice, again, inside this burial mound was to tone and to chant and to sort of move into that liminal active imaginal space where we could begin to sort of perceive what this site was not only used for, but the information that the ancestors hold there that were buried in this place. So let's move on to Glastonbury Tor.
This is another place that's very special to me, and was actually where I was drawn to take pilgrimage in 2009, which pilgrimage directly led to me meeting Dr. Megan Rose. This is the Glastonbury Tor in the town of the same name in Somerset, England. And it's not only considered to be a deeply sacred place to many pagans, but it's also considered to be the most sacred place in Britain by the Catholic Church. This tower here is the remnants of a 12th century abbey that was built on the ruins of an earlier church that had been destroyed by an earthquake in the 6th century. Not very common in this part of the world. And we have kind of etched into these hills, which really appears to be man-made, this sort of spiral labyrinthian pattern. And the tradition is that the procession would have led not up these modern walkways that you can see there, but would have spiraled back and forth on the hillside, making the way to the top with torches and celebration in this meditative, walking trance meditation, you could say, following this spiral pattern. So on the right is a little bit more diagram of how that spiral appears to work and that spiral path appears to work. There's other traditions about this hill being hollow and being the home of Gwyn ap Neith, who is the Welsh lord of the underworld and king of the fairies, and is basically an aspect of the green man or the horned god. And that this hill is the entrance to his realm, his underworld realm of Annavin or Avalon.
So I realize we're almost at time. We did get started a little bit late. Do you want to talk briefly about this, and then we'll move on to the Clutie tree and wrap up?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So this is a map drawn by Paulden Jenkins, that Druid guide and researcher that we've mentioned several times. And this is basically a picture of Iron Age Somerset in the southwest of England, pre-Roman, when all of these rivers signified by the weaving dark blue lines would have flooded seasonally, in some cases for many, many miles on either side, creating this vast inland rune sea and marsh. And if you are wondering where the modern day coastline is, it's way up in the top left corner at Breen Down. And the actual modern day coastline of Cornwall follows this sandbar directly to the south until about the middle of that side of the page, where the Cornish Peninsula begins jutting out into the west. So the tradition here is that Glastonbury Tor, that hill in the center where all of those lines converge, is synonymous with the ancient Isle of Avalon, which was a seasonal island during these flooding times in the pre-Roman times. And the tradition that emerged, the oral tradition that was collected by the pagan author Marion Zimmer Bradley in the book Mists of Avalon, was that the world of humanity and the world of magic or fairy lay on top of each other, but had been drifting steadily apart for many, many centuries. And so around the 6th century, the time of the Arthurian legends, this was an access point to both. And sailing across the summer sea into the mists with the proper mindset and incantation would take you not to Glastonbury of the monks, but to the holy Isle of Avalon.
All right, so we're going to quickly talk about Clutie trees and wrap up. So Clutie trees are usually associated with sacred wells. On the left here, you're seeing the Chalice Well in Glastonbury, and on the right, Sancreed Well in Cornwall. And the Celtic folkloric tradition of tying rags to trees dates back to the time of the dolmen, so 5,500 years ago. And the practice is you cleanse yourself with the water of the sacred well, you say your prayer, and then you tie your wish with this rag or fabric to the tree. And it's an offering to the nature spirits and a remembrance of your wish or desire. Now, I want to just pause here and say that using leave no trace protocols has been requested of many of these sacred sites. So you want to first check to make sure that there is not a leave no trace protocol for the sacred site if you're visiting. And then if you do leave Clutie, make sure you're using a natural material that's going to decompose. And offerings in general should always be natural materials that can decompose into the land or be washed away. Again, a practice here that we did was this sort of ritualized prayer where we did ablutions with the water. You can scry into the water, and then you tie your rag to the tree. All right, so what I want to leave you with is a deepening practice invitation. And that is this: when you go home tonight, think back on a spot that we presented here today, and using your active imagination, journey to that spot. Maybe to just explore the terrain. Maybe you'll meet an ancestor. Maybe you'll meet a being of the land. But just remain open to the messages, the emotions, the ideas, the images that arise, and then write them down. Take notes. Because in this way, pilgrimage can happen without even leaving your home, which I think is a really beautiful way of ending this. So if you'd like a copy of this slideshow, you can request a copy at my website, drmeganrose.com, and you can learn more about Indigo and myself and our work at entheosis.org. I think that we might have a few minutes for questions. I know they're transitioning to another presentation now, but I'm going to stop my slide share. And if there's anyone that has a burning question, you can either type it in the chat or unmute yourself, and we will hang out here for a few minutes until the next presentation needs to start.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Yes, thank you so much, Ryan and Megan. So yeah, if anyone has a question, please go ahead and raise your hand, and then unmute yourself. We'll do maybe 5 minutes or so. We started a little bit late, so
yeah, we started about 10 minutes late. So yeah, 5 minutes.
5 minutes late. Okay, we can do a little bit more than that then. Yeah. So.
But these rooms are sort of just open until the next people show up, correct?
Yeah. The next presenters are here, but yeah, while we're waiting, we definitely can.
Okay. Well, I'm not seeing any questions, but you can raise your hand.
Yeah, you want to come up? You want to come up and ask it?
Sure.
Yeah.
It's not for wimps. One of the things that I find really interesting looking at these diagrams of how these circles were connected and the description of the firelit procession is perhaps here we find the origin of the Pendragon, the sacred dragon who guarded Britain. And this will tie into the Arthurian mythos and the tales of Uther, possibly being buried at Stonehenge. It was one theory at one time. And there, I don't know if you've read it or not. You mentioned Marion Zimmer Bradley's Myths of Babylon, which I love. I mean, it was like, oh my God, what I believe is a religion at one time. Oh my God. And I was like 21, 22 years old. But before that, there was Mary Stewart's Merlin trilogy. And that was also another one where, there's a discussion of, the this Celtic and Roman blend, and this ability to experience vision in crystal caves, and also the flooded caves of Sgomsium, Gwynedd up in North Wales. And if you haven't read those, it's a very rationalist approach, but it's a really well told story, and it provides sort of a picture of that period when Celtic Britain and Roman Britain were under threat from the Saxon invasions of the 5th and 6th centuries. And so it really captures a lot of the religious and spiritual ferment of that period.
Beautiful. Thank you for that share.
Thank you.
And those were called the Merlin trilogy by Mary Stewart, I believe.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Christian. Thank you so much for a fantastic presentation. I really enjoyed it. I'm curious, you hit some of the highlights for the destinations that you visited during your pilgrimage. I'm curious about looking at pilgrimage another way, which is not destination focused, but travel focused. And so I'm curious if you had any reflections on what it was like just walking between these very incredible sites. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I can say that particularly in the case of the West Kennet Long Barrow, was at the very end of the day. It had been a very long day. We'd visited Stonehenge in the morning and Avebury in the afternoon. And it was literally like 10 o'clock at night when we got to the West Kennet Long Barrow. And the minute we got out of the car, I could feel there was just this numinous presence. And so I began to process, and you have to process up a hill to get to the barrow. And I began to process in the dark. I decided not to use my light and to just walk up this path. And it became this deep entrancement or meditative walking, which really was present with us throughout a lot of this. And Indigo referenced, the labyrinthine or the meditative walking of walking up the hill. So, and sometimes just the arduous nature of getting somewhere, as we're traveling in vehicles, we're trying to get to these different places. And there's an aspect to pilgrimage that is often like very physically challenging. If you think about like the road to Compostela and the arduous nature of walking, and that feels like it is a part of like the transmission, and also the kind of like sloughing off the outer skin, or sloughing off the day-to-day routine, and really like fixing your attention to something, right? So the whole process, the whole undertaking is this kind of ritualized, can be meditative, can also be like really stirring things up, but usually in the sense of like you're stirring things up and then you're releasing. You're stirring things up and then you're releasing. And that was certainly my experience.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I said a little bit about the spiral procession up the Glastonbury Tor, and we also have participated for a long time in a community here in the Bay Area called the Reclaiming Community. Pagan author Starhawk, and she has a spiral dance that she's been leading with a number of other people for 40 years. And you wouldn't think that it's possible to have 1,000 people in a room or in a field all holding hands, and then each end of that line dancing in and out of each other in this interweaving spiral without anyone ever having to let go. But it's possible. It's really cool. It becomes this group walking trance meditation. And then there was another place that we visited, I believe it was in Cornwall, where it, outwardly looks like just this little narrow hiking trail, but it was a path of pilgrimage that had been used for like 1,000 years.
Yeah, so the embodied nature, right? We're talking about connecting to the earth and connecting to our bodies. And so the embodied movements and actions are really an important part of pilgrimage.
Thank you so much. That's great.
Thank you.
Hi, guys.
Hi, Henry.
Very, very,
Hey, Henry.
very, very good. Very accessible and a very good addition to everything that's happening here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Henry was with us on our 2016 pilgrimage. All
All
right.
right, well, I hope everyone will join me in thanking our wonderful presenters, and we will get going on the next presentation or the next panel. We'll start that in just 1 second.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Many blessings.
Yeah.